say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, let's please give another round of applause to the Troy High School Navy Junior ROTC Honor Guard and Ali Solario for that beautiful tribute to our nation. Thank you. Thank you to all. You may now be seated. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Martha, because not only has she been a great friend to my family and to me over the years, not only does she hail from Bergen County, although you were born in Buffalo. No, anyway, close enough, close by. But does hail from Bergen County, which is where my grandfather spent the last few years of his life. So my family's always felt a close connection to Martha. And of course, she was such a great reporter for CNBC in college when I was investing in the market. I always saw Martha's reports and did very well because of her, so thank you for that. But of course, Martha is very well known now for her work on Fox News, which she joined in 2004. And of course, she hosts The Story at 7 p.m. on Fox News and is the executive director of that. We all love that show. And of course, tonight, we're going to talk about her book, Unknown Valor. And I'm going to turn the stage over to her in a second. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't say that he didn't have to join the war effort, but he decided to do that. And some of the stories that are in Martha's book are so poignant to me because they remind me of the last story my grandfather ever told me, which was several weeks before his death. We were watching a video called The World at War. And the particular video we were watching was about the Pacific. And my grandfather wasn't the President of the United States to me. He was Ba. That's what we called him. And this time, Ba told me, he stopped the video every now and then and said, yes, I served on this island. I served on Guadalcanal. This is what it was like to be there. This is how terrible the fighting was, or this is when we were bombed. And I got this sense of what a World War II veteran went through in the Pacific Theater. And Martha's book brings out so many wonderful stories about what the soldiers went through, about what the Navy sailors went through in World War II, and brings out so many personal stories about the home front and what people went through on the home front, and marries that with a sweep of history of the rise of Japan to being a military power and then to being defeated by the United States. It is a brilliant book. I'm almost through it completely, and I really am so excited not only to hear Martha and her talk about history, but to really remember an era that is rapidly fading from history now as we lose that World War II generation. That's why tonight is so special to me, and I'm so happy to have Martha here, and I can't wait to hear what she has to tell us tonight. It's going to be an exciting night. Thank you, Martha, for coming here. We look forward to hearing your stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so grateful for the friendship of your family, and we do hail from the same neck of the woods. And it was always special when President Nixon was living in Saddle River for all of us. And my own memories of, as a young child, my grandfather was the chair of the Republican Party in Westchester, very active in politics. And so when I was a kid, we had all these, Nixon Now buttons and bumper stickers, and we just loved, his enthusiasm about it. So I just think, I can't imagine what my grandfather, he would be so thrilled that I am here tonight. And I'm so honored to be at the Nixon Library. I had an extraordinary tour today. This is such a beautiful, special place. And to see the birthplace of President Nixon and how humble it was, and the love for music and books. And it reminds me really of, some of the things that I talk about in this book. Just these sort of simple, hardworking people that my family was as well. Coming from a humble background, but the importance of education and learning and music and literature. So it just was wonderful to be here today and to see his resting place and this beautiful, the gardens, it's just exquisite, and the tree that has been here since the beginning. So I thank you so much. And I thank Chairman Jim Kavanaugh and his wife Esther, who I had the pleasure of dining with tonight, and John Hamilton and his wife, who I've just so enjoyed being with, and Sandy Quinn as well. Thank you so much for welcoming me here tonight, and Chris Nordyke, who's done an amazing job of organizing all of this evening. And Cindy Scott, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, she gave me a speed tour today, and she was amazing. So Cindy, thank you so much, and it was great to meet your husband tonight as well. And Colonel Jack Brennan, who I got to meet, President Nixon's military aide in the White House, and the first Marine in U.S. history to hold that position. So I've met some really special people here tonight. So I thank you all for welcoming me here this evening. So when I was growing up, I was a little bit of a nosy kid, and I used to snoop around my grandparents' attic in Peekskill, New York, all the time. And I would just wander off while my parents and the grandparents were downstairs, and I would go up into this attic on the third floor, a small house in Peekskill, New York, and just sort of fish around. And my grandfather was someone who followed World War II very closely, because obviously it was very personal for everyone who was living during that time and the sacrifices that they made. And I found this scrapbook that he had, and it had all these articles and maps and photos of Iwo Jima. And on the front, it said, he just written on a little piece of paper, the story of Iwo Jima, and he put it underneath the plastic. And in the back of it was a picture of his nephew, Harry Gray. So I was always fascinated. At that time when I found it, I had no idea what Iwo Jima was. It just sounded like a strange name. And I wasn't all that interested when I first read it in the beginning. But over time, my mother would share his stories with me and talk about her very close cousin, Harry, who she loved. My mom was an only child, and so he was sort of a big brother to her. And his father died when he was young. He was only 12 years old. So my grandfather, Frank Bose, became like a dad to him. Harry was 18 when he enlisted, and he started writing letters home. And I read them. I was captivated by them as a child. He went to Parris Island, like so many young Marines. And my grandfather really didn't want him to go. No one wanted them to go, of course, but he was determined to fight for his country. And he wanted very much to go, even though he was turning 18, graduating from high school when the war was almost over. So here is one example of the letters that I read when I was starting to go through his things. And my mom wanted all of us She made copies of all these letters and she gave them to my sisters and I because she wanted his memory to last. And I know that she would be very proud that his story is being retold in Unknown Valor. So here's just one example. Dear Mom and family, how is everyone? I'm fine, except for a slight cold, which I should be rid of soon. I suppose you're wondering where I am. Well, the place is Iwo. I have been here a week. And believe me, it's no picnic. I'm praying to get off this place and soon, but it looks like another week yet. I've not been to the front lines, but it sure is hot where I am. The first few days I was dodging mortar shells and artillery every minute, but now it seems to be mostly over. Our Marine artillery is firing over our heads continually. Right now it's the bang and whistling of shells. 2 other fellows and myself are in a hole, and you can bet it's very secure. We have worked hard on it, putting bags all around and on the roof. We had 1 air raid, and Mom, you can bet I was plenty scared. The living conditions are good, and the chow is surprisingly good, and plenty of it. I can only write 1 letter a day, so please tell Dot, this was his girlfriend, that I will write her tomorrow. Well, Mom, I'll go into it more about this place later, and I'll write every chance I get. Bob and George are here. All my love, Harry. Harry was killed days later in a Japanese mortar attack on March 13th when the island was almost secured. When I decided to write this book, I went to visit my Aunt Nancy in Clifton Park, New York. She's 89 years old, and she's Harry's sister. She's the only remaining relative that could give me firsthand information about their lives. So I talked to her about growing up in Arlington, Massachusetts, and how they had lost their father when they were young. And I just wanted to learn more about Harry's personality and what he was like. And she loved talking about him, and she, obviously was very enthusiastic about having his memory be part of this book. There's the narratives of several young men in this book, and it weaves through the history of the Pacific Theater in the path that they were in, which was the eastern route under Chester Nimitz. But she was obviously enthusiastic about his story being told. And she shared letters with me that were written by 2 other men, Warren Graham and George Coburn, who Harry had mentioned in his letters. You heard him mention there. Bob and George are here. And she had tried to track down anybody that she could find that might have been with Harry when he was killed because they knew very few details. I read the reports that came back in the Marine documents, and it said that there was a head wound, not a lot of details about the details of what happened. But going through the process of talking to her and reading these letters, I had never really intended to write a book. I wanted to get more information about this small piece of family history. But I feel now that something was just pulling me to tell this story. And I think the reason that I found Harry so captivating to me was because I felt that my family had somebody who was missing, just a grief, a hole that's left in any military family who loses someone. And I thought about movies that I'd seen, like Saving Private Ryan, and there's always the hero and the person who's the big, sort of center of the story. But then there are all those other guys on the beach. And I thought, every one of those guys who doesn't have a name in these movies has a family, and has a family that was left grieving him really forever. And so that's why I named the book Unknown Valor, because there's a quote from Admiral Chester Nimitz, who said after Iwo Jima, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." And that is etched in the World War II memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. But for these men in this story, Warren Graham and George Coburn and Charles Gubish and Dominic Grassi, there's no memorial to them specifically. Their valor was unknown, really only to each other. And the brotherhood that they shared and the love that these Marines had for each other on this island, from all of the men that I have talked to, and I met one gentleman here, Mr. Visconti, who's 95 and who served on Iwo Jima, and showed me a photograph tonight of him on top of Mount Suribachi at the flag raising, taking a picture. So these men understand the love that they have for each other. So I think my goal really was to tell the little stories of the Pacific Theater and to inspire other people to dig into those letters. And I have to say, ever since I have been talking to people about the book, I've had so many people come up to me. A gentleman came up to me downstairs and said, you know, I have an incredible diary of his father had flown a B-29 that he kept. So I wanted to encourage people to dig into these stories, to read the diaries, to read the journals that were left by these heroes, because all of them are heroes, even if their valor is unknown. So I realized when I started writing this book, which I thought was just going to be sort of a small family story, then I thought, no, I need to start really at the beginning, because it really goes back to Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor is, of course, what inspired these young men to line up. I mean, Winston Churchill spent the Christmas of 1941 for 3 weeks. He showed up uninvited and kind of moved into the White House for 3 weeks and, you know, slept on the second floor and walked around in his bathrobe, and sometimes less than that, after his bath with his cigar. And he wanted to talk to FDR every night until the wee hours, and they would sit together and have a scotch and convince him that the United States had to come to the aid of Great Britain. But of course, the United States wanted nothing to do with it. The memories of World War I and trench warfare were still so entrenched in people's minds that they thought, you know what, if these countries want to go to war against each other every few years, let them do it, but we're not going to get involved. But of course, all of that changed when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So I realized that I had to go there to start the beginning of this story. And as it worked out, I got to go through work because President Trump was beginning his first trip to Asia at Pearl Harbor. So I went there and I had a chance to tour the Arizona and to learn more about what happened at Pearl Harbor, which was just really an amazing trip. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to do that. If you haven't, I really recommend it. But one of the things that really struck me, I spent some time just looking at the wall of the names and reading those names. And on that wall and most of the deaths were on the Arizona and some in the Oklahoma, and some obviously around Ford Island and the base. But on that wall, there were 23 sets of brothers. There were 3 families, the Beckers, the Dohertys, and the Murdochs, who had 3 sons, 3 brothers on those ships. And in each of those 3 families, only 1 young man survived. So after Pearl Harbor, my family, my grandpa, my Aunt Ann, all of them sat around the radio and listened to what FDR told them, because everything had changed once Pearl Harbor was attacked. And FDR, of course, talked about the Day of Infamy, and everybody sat around their radios listening to it. But what strikes me is a bit of what comes later in that speech. He goes through the ongoing attacks after Pearl Harbor to give everyone a sense of the gravity of what is facing the United States. He says, last night Japan attacked Hong Kong. Last night Japan attacked Guam. Last night Japan attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning the Japanese attacked Midway Island. It was a shock across the country. But war strategists had imagined and had gamed out a confrontation between the United States and Japan for some time. After the Spanish and American War and after World War I, Guam and the Philippines, after the Spanish and American War, had come into U.S. protection, and Japan had expanded its reach into China, of course, in the Sino-Japanese War. But there was a plan that was developed by war strategists known as War Plan Orange, and it gamed out a potential confrontation between Japan and the United States, and it envisioned a stepping stone campaign, much like the one that we ended up seeing. But what they imagined would happen was an attack on Guam, because it was the westernmost U.S. territory, and it was the most likely place that Japan would attack. No one envisioned that the attack on the first day would decimate the U.S. fleet and leave us in such a vulnerable position. There was one man, though, who did envision that, and that was World War I pioneer aviator Billy Mitchell. But he had a reputation for needling and rattling the top brass, and in the end, no one listened to him. But when FDR gave that address, he concluded it with this: hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of the people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. What followed, of course, was a brutal island campaign through the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and ultimately the Marianas, all moving towards Iwo Jima, where the stories of these men's lives converge on this tiny 8-mile patch of island that is mostly rock and almost no vegetation at all. So I knew after going to Pearl Harbor, as I got into the writing of this book, that I also had to go to Iwo Jima to see it for myself. It's quite a journey, as you would imagine. It was about 17 hours to Tokyo, and then we went to Guam, and then from Guam to Iwo Jima. Now, you can only go to, Iwo Jima is back in Japanese hands, and that happened at the end of the 60s, which seems odd in a way, but on the other hand, it was never the intention of the United States to take over that territory. And once the war was over, it over the years, another 20 plus years, it went back into Japanese hands. But you have to get special permission to go on. There's usually 2 planes that go to the reunion of honor once a year in March at the same time as the battle. So I fortunately was able to get on one of those flights and go. There's an amazing sense of camaraderie on the plane because everyone is going for similar reasons, but there were veterans on the plane, veterans of Iwo Jima, journalists like myself, reporters, family members, photographers. There are escorts for the gentlemen who are going to Iwo Jima who were veterans. So it was there's just really interesting sort of, there was kind of a jovial mood on the plane as we all got off because we're all sort of on this incredible journey. And I remember in the airport, I was annoyed because it seemed very disorganized and there was like no line and it wasn't, we were waiting and the plane was, everything was backed up. And then I saw this gentleman with his World War II veteran hat on and his blazer. And he was clearly in his 90s and he was patiently standing in line waiting his turn. And I thought, so will I. So, as we were getting closer to Iwo, I had had conversations with 2 men who were going back. Bob Clemens was with his son and his grandson, and he said to me, I didn't really want to come, but they made me. And he had never been back. And he was concerned about it. I spoke with him the day before, and I interviewed him, and I asked him what it was like there and how he felt about going back, and he was reluctant. He had a lot of very difficult memories. It was a brutal, as all the islands were, but Iwo Jima was particularly brutal. In fact, Robert Sherrod, who was an embed reporter for Time, war correspondent, said that people came apart on Iwo Jima in ways that he had never seen. And Bob Clemens told me that he had memories of running over limbs as he was told to just keep running, keep getting to the other side of the island and killing as many enemies as you can. So as we got closer, the plane dipped below the clouds, and all of a sudden you could just see Mount Suribachi looming at the end of this tiny patch of island. And it got very quiet on the plane as I watched these men's faces looking out the window, and you could just see it all coming back for them. And Rondo Sharf was also on the plane. He was in the Navy, and he forged a baptismal certificate that he stole from his church at 16 so that he could join. And he is still that way. I just saw him the other night. He had on, like, when I met him, he had on green running glasses and like a neon green t-shirt and running shorts and sneakers. And he said, yeah, I was on Iwo. And I said, no, you weren't. You're too young to be on Iwo. He said, yeah, I was. I was there. I was 16, And they put me in charge. I was good with boats, so they put me in charge of, driving this Higgins boat in the landing. And so this 16-year-old kid had all of these guys on his boat, and he said we hit an obstruction on the way in, and the wheel of the Higgins boat went right into his sternum and broke it, and broke part of his face. And they lost 14 men. And he said, I got pulled right off, and they took me to a hospital ship. He said, but I come back here. He's been back, I think, 7 times. He said, I come back as often as I can because I want to remember the guys that I left behind. He said, I still have nightmares sometimes. And he said, I have this dream that I'm in the cemetery, and I'm at my buddies' graves, and I say to them, you can switch places with me for a weekend, but then I want to come back. He has an amazing spirit, and he's such a positive guy, but it is so clear that it's still, he said, I got to have a life, I got to get married, I have a wife, I got to have kids, and all I think about all the time are these guys that I left on the island. So meeting them was just a really moving way to begin telling the actual part of Iwo Jima and the battle. I walked on the black sand beaches and learned where Harry Gray and Dominic Grassi and Warren Graham and Charlie Gubish and George Coburn, which beaches they landed on with the 3rd Division. They came in a couple days after the 4th and 5th Divisions. And it really helped me understand the scale of the island. We climbed Mount Suribachi and looked down at the beaches to get a sense of that as well. And, I wanted to see, of course, where the flag was raised. And it's interesting because it's just like a cement circle with a kind of a cut-off pipe in it. And someone had to show it to me. And I said, oh, that's where it was. And everybody's taking pictures up there. And the thing about the flag raising is it's such an iconic image. And there were 2 flag raisings, but the second one, of course, is the photo that everyone knows so well. But I think most people, obviously, if you're familiar with the battle, you know this, but if you're not as familiar with it, think that flag raising was the triumphant moment of the Battle of Iwo Jima, but it happened on day 5. And the battle dragged on for another 31 days. And 3 of the men in that famous flag raising picture were killed within days. So when I got back from Iwo Jima, a researcher that I had been working with at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, a young man who is very interested in World War II history and has made it his mission to get in touch with as many living, surviving veterans as he can. And we had been kind of working together on some research. And he had a friend who was 100 years old who was injured on the same day that Harry Gray was killed, on March 13th, 1945. And he said he had asked him if he remembered Harry, and he said he didn't. So he had asked me to send him a picture of Harry on my phone. And I had a picture of him in his military uniform. And I did. And when I landed from Iwo Jima, he called me. He said, I need to talk to you right away. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, I showed Charlie the picture, and he said, oh, yeah, that's Harry Gray. I know Harry Gray. He said, I was with him. I was with him when it happened. And so I realized that I had to get to Charlie right away and to hear what he knew and to hear his story. And I was so reluctant to even call my Aunt Nancy, Harry's sister, because she had for so long had wanted to meet someone who knew his story or who could give her any bit of comfort and fill in some of the blanks. But I was worried because I thought, he didn't remember him at first, and now he does. I just wanted to be sure. And I had letters that explained what had happened that day, so I just needed to make sure it all lined up. So I went to see Charlie, and I showed him the picture, and he said, yeah, that's my buddy Gray. He had always called him Gray, so he didn't recognize Harry at first. He said, I was 24, he was 18, so he called me Pop. And he said, yeah, he would say to me, Pop, you sleep, I'll watch. And it was incredible. So I did eventually bring my aunt down. Not eventually. I said, well, I'm going to get, my Aunt Nancy and bring her down to meet Charlie. My husband said, how old is Charlie? I said, 100. He said, you got to bring her down there tomorrow. Okay, maybe you're right. So George Coburn was another person who wrote a letter to my grandfather after Harry was killed. And I had this letter in all my research for such a long time. I couldn't find him. We had made efforts. We couldn't find him. So this letter is from George after Harry was killed. Dear Uncle Frank, although I never met you, Harry told me much about you. I guess you were sort of like a father to him after his dad died. I met Harry coming overseas on the boat. Harry and I went swimming at Enewetak Island in the Marshalls. We were great buddies. It seems we went every place together. You're right. It was a job writing to his mother, but it had to be done. Harry was up at the front only one day when he got hit. Like I said in the letter to Mrs. Gray, he was hit by a mortar and he was killed instantly. We left for Iwo together. I guess we were all pretty scared. He's buried in the 3rd Division Cemetery there. There's a lot of things I'd like to tell you, but I can't say in a letter. I'll get a chance the next time I see you when I'm home, and we'll talk it over. Harry's buddy, George. George lived in the next town over, and he and Harry knew each other a little bit. They played football against each other, but they really got to know each other on the USS Rochambeau on their way across the ocean. So when I was finishing my research, I had written about that moment at Enewetak Island and about them swimming. And I tried to fill in as much as I could based on what I knew, but it was bothering me that I didn't have George's story. Because I thought, there were just a few moments in the book that I had a hard time filling in the pieces. So I literally, I couldn't fall asleep one night. I had been writing late, and I said, I'm going to go back down and look at his file one more time. So I brought his file upstairs and I started going through all of his papers again. And I found this piece of paper that I hadn't seen before. And it was a request for his military records. And it said on it, when I moved from New England to Florida, I lost my discharge papers. If you could please send them to me. And there was an address in Florida. So I immediately Googled I looked for an obituary for George Coburn, and in Florida, and I couldn't find one. And I called Dean Lawback, who had helped me with research and contacting some of these guys. I said, Dean, I think George Coburn is alive, and I think he's living in Florida. So by 9 o'clock the next morning, we found a phone number for him, and we called him, and I said, George, this is Martha MacCallum. I'm Harry Gray's niece. And he just went silent on the other end of the phone. And he said, Martha, I think about Harry all the time. He said, we were really great buddies. He said, he was such a brave kid. And he said, we weren't just friends. We were closer than brothers. And I thought that was such a beautiful expression. I thought that I could name the book Closer Than Brothers. George and I had a great talk. He said, I often thought Harry would have lived a better life than I did. And I said, why? And he said, well, I had a drinking problem for a while, and my first marriage fell apart. I wasn't a good person. And he said, but, then I remarried, and, we had kids, and I have grandkids. I said, well, it sounds like you have a lot of family. How many grandkids? Oh, I don't even know. So George has just become a dear friend of mine. And last weekend, we had an amazing celebration in Washington for the Iwo Jima 75th anniversary. And George was there with his wife, who is lovely, and 14 members of his family, who are fantastic, and he's been a wonderful dad, and he has an amazing family. And I said, George, you have a beautiful family. You've lived an amazing life. And later that night, his wife, Carlene, said to me, you know what, Martha? My grandson, Nate, who was there, who looked just like the pictures of George when he was 18, she said, he came up to me tonight and he said, You know what, Grandma? My name never meant much to me before tonight, but now I'm really proud to be a Coburn. So Congress put together a resolution to recognize the veterans of Iwo Jima for the 75th anniversary. And here's part of what it said. The Battle of Iwo Jima led to 22 United States Marines and 5 members of the United States Navy to receive the Medal of Honor, the most ever to receive the highest military decoration in the United States for a single battle, and representing more than 1/5 of all United States Marines receiving the decoration during all of World War II. The secured airfields on Iwo Jima became an emergency landing location for 22 B-29 bombers, saving the lives of an estimated 24,000 airmen. 160 days following the pivotal battle and the victory at Iwo Jima, the United States received the unconditional surrender of Japan on September the 2nd, 1945.
February 1945. World War II had been raging for nearly 6 years. U.S. forces battled across the Stepping Stone Islands, inching closer to mainland Japan.
Ahead now stood Iwo Jima, the most heavily fortified island in the world.
On the brink of battle, Kurabayashi watched the sea from his command post, waiting for the attack.
They're going on the toughest assignment of Marine Corps history.
We were all jacked up, you know. Most of us couldn't figure out why we were taking that wee little place and why we needed so many Marines to do it.
"24 hours after the battle began, more than 500 Americans were dead and nearly 2,000 wounded.
There was an odor of death on the island.
We thought they were Japs laying on a pile covered with ponchos. They weren't Japs, they were Marines.
The commanding officer asked me, as the only flamethrower operator left, could I do something about some of these pillboxes that had installed? My remark was,
That's Woody Williams. In the 34th replacement draft, is this someone that you recognize?
Oh yeah. That was my buddy, Gray. I think his name was Gray.
He was my uncle.
He was my buddy, foxhole buddy. He'd always call me Pop.
I ended up buddy more with Harry. Thank God we had
That's
each
George.
other, you know. We were laying in a crater, me and Harry. He gave me a quick hug and he took off. That's the night that we had an awful mortar attack. One of them landed right between Harry and the kid next to him. Killed both of them. And I went over and I wanted to kick him, like, why did you do this? No, don't you know I love you? I never saw him again.
"75 years have passed since the last days of World War II. Lives have been lived, children and grandchildren born, but when the men of Iwo Jima reflect, they still wonder sometimes why they were spared and others were not.
So what we had to do to keep our country free.
We have time for a few questions if you have any questions.
Yeah, we are going to take a few questions, but there's one thing that I just realized that we should recognize. In that film was Herschel Woody Williams with the flamethrower. He was a guest here, and with us tonight, there's a number of guests, some World War II veterans. Those that are here, would you at least raise your hand if you can stand to be recognized? Please do so. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. We're going to take a couple questions from the audience, and I know our social media team is working to get some from the internet and from the world. Our first one is going to come from one of our young cadets that presented the colors tonight. Sir, what is your question?
So my question is, you've clearly spent countless hours compiling this great novel, and in doing so, you must have interacted with countless great people and priceless sources of knowledge from these veterans. So in your time researching this book, what was the most powerful message you learned, and how has that affected your life?
You know what? Honestly, I feel like writing this was just a gift that I learned so much from these men about life, and their humility is overwhelming to me. Their courage, and they also have just a very kind of, they've lived so much life. And so they also, most of them had a good sense of humor, and they don't take themselves too seriously because they've seen so much. But I would say just their overwhelming humility. I think we live in a time that is so self-centered, and the biggest lesson that I learned from these men is that they wanted to do something that was bigger than themselves, for a cause that was greater than anything that was about them. And I think that's a lesson that we can all learn something from. I know I can.
Our next question from the audience, written on the 3x5 card that I have here, is there someone that you would like to interview that you have not interviewed yet?
That's a good question. I've interviewed a lot of people. You know what, honestly, I've interviewed presidents and lots of really powerful people. But I really think that the most satisfying work that I've done is the work of talking with these veterans. Like Jack Gutman is here, my friend Jack Gutman, who fought at Normandy. And Jack, will you stand up? Stand up.
Thank you.
So I can't think of anyone more famous that I really... Hi, Jack.
Martha, I thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure being here. Last time we talked, we were in Normandy together last year at the anniversary. And being one of the veterans, I was a medic. We made the invasion of Normandy on D-Day on Omaha Beach, and then also the invasion of Okinawa. I want to thank you for making people aware of those wonderful men that gave their lives and were wounded. I watched those men up on the screen. I can't help but remember they were young and died. And thank you for making everyone aware so they could honor those people.
Thank you, Jack. You know what? I just want to say something about Jack, because I don't know if everybody could hear that, but Jack is one of the few people who fought in Europe, in Normandy, and also at Okinawa. That is an amazing service. And now Jack has made a focus of his life, because he suffered from PTSD and difficulties from coming back from those experiences, and he's made it the focus of his life to reach out to veterans and to help them overcome their own fears about going on living. And that is a tremendous problem, obviously, and it's something that we need to really focus on. And Jack is just an incredible hero to these young men today, and I'm so grateful for the work that he's doing.
Martha, center section towards the back.
Oh, I just want to ask you, how long did it take you to write the book, and how long did the research take before you did write the book?
It took me about 3 years from start to finish. I have a day job, so it was a little bit, I I wrote like in the morning, I wrote late at night. I had Ron Drez, who is a military historian, who really helped me make sure that the battle sequences on the islands were all accurate because I was never in the military, so I wanted to make sure that they were correctly done, and he did an amazing job of helping me with that, which was great. So, 3 years of, a lot of early mornings and late nights. My husband says, the next book's a picture book, right?
Martha Center, all the way in the back.
Hi, Martha. I teach locally here in Orange County. I'm a AP government teacher. My question is, the kids, getting these stories into the kids today, they won't read and they won't embrace these kind of stories. I'm just curious what you thought, how we can get this and keep these stories alive with the kids' generation, especially social media and stuff. Their attention span is just so minute. They get in and read something like this is so...
It's a problem, really. I mean, think about it. These guys at 17, 18, 16 begging to serve their country, right? And to forge documents. I mean, obviously, we live in a very different world now. I mean, you've got, a lot of young people who are interested in socialism, like a third. So these young men were fighting to protect freedom in the world, to have the democracy and the country that we have, and it worries me that you've got, this percentage. I never thought I'd see that in my life in the United States of America, who think this is an interesting idea. So I do worry about that, and it's definitely one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I have 3 of those people in that age group who live in my house, who are my children, so I also wanted them to read this story. I think that's what we can do. We can give them examples like Jack Gutman, and my son was with me and met Jack this summer, and that's such a powerful example. These men are treasures, and they will not be with us forever, like any of us. Well, none of us will be here forever, but I hope that we find ways to get these stories in front of them, because God forbid, we will be challenged again in the world in a different way, but we need to understand, they need to understand how precious what we have is. Thank you.
Martha. Section off to your left, all the way in the back. Sir, what is your question?
My question is, how has this experience for you affected your family, and has it influenced them to take it further, to take it to the next level, not only with World War II, but Vietnam and other conflicts afterward?
Yeah. Well, it's been really an amazing thing for my Aunt Nancy and myself and my cousins. We all gathered together at the 75th anniversary last weekend. And it's just been an extraordinary experience for us as a family to learn more and to meet these men. So I had my Aunt Nancy and George Coburn, who was Harry's good buddy, and Charlie Gubish all together last weekend. And that's just my family. But that's what I'm saying. This isn't just about this story. It's about all of these stories and all of these men who exist in all of our families, and finding out what you can find out about them and sharing those stories with the younger generation, which is another way to bring it home for them and to make it real to them. My son is named Harry, my youngest, after Harry Gray. And, so I think we find ways to do that. And as far as Vietnam, I think, the guys that I worked with who did the Iwo Jima tour, they go back to the battlefields, to Normandy, and they also go to Vietnam. And I would like to join them on one of those trips, because obviously it's a whole nother story. And here at the Nixon Library, there's obviously a rich history of that period. And I think that we're getting to the point now where we need to explain to young people what that was in more detail and in more depth with the stories of the people who were there. So maybe that'll be next.
We have time for one last question, and our question is going to come from 9-year-old Samara, who is at Brookhaven Elementary. Samara, what is your question?
How do you like being on Fox News?
Thank you, Savannah. Thank you. Why don't you want to come up here and I'll answer you? Savannah. So I do like being on Fox News because it gives me an opportunity to see the history that I'm living in and to cover stories. I've covered, this is my 5th presidential election, which makes me feel really old, but it is. It's my 5th one. So it gives me an opportunity to tell stories, which is what I love to do. That's why I named my show The Story, because I wanted it to be a little bit of a deeper dive into the news of the day. So I feel really lucky. I didn't really plan on doing this work when I was growing up. What do you want to be when you grow up? See, that's a good choice. I think you're going to be a huge success. Thank you so much, Savannah. Good luck to
Martha
you,
Samara,
Dr. Savannah.
thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Martha MacCallum.
much.
She will be available up in our lobby to sign your books. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.